Hi everyone, Harry here to talk about a much anticipated decision from the Chief Judge of the DC District Court, Jeb Booseberg, in the case that is the sort of granddaddy of them all in the Alien Enemies Act area. This is the one that arose and first brought to public awareness the whole kind of scandalous and unconstitutional outrage of the way the Trump administration were shipping hundreds of deportees down to El Salvador, there to be housed and disappeared in what alternatively could be called a high-tech prison, but also we've used the word gulag and torture pit, and those more dramatic characterizations actually are germane, as I'll mention again in a moment. But to restate the bidding, which was complicated, on March 15th, people contacted lawyers to tell them there were aliens in the country who were being rounded up and shipped somewhere. It was all a big mystery to them, just all of a sudden being disappeared and stuck on planes. Lawyers rushed into the chambers of Judge Booseberg on a Saturday, told him what was going on, and Booseberg, after some very kind of cursory fact-finding, told the DOJ not to send them down, and if the planes had left, to turn the planes around. Now there followed a whole kind of squirrely, evasive maneuvers by DOJ, including saying, well, we thought your oral order didn't matter. What mattered was your written order. And then eventually they were able to say, I'm sorry, it's too late, Judge, the plane is now over international airspace. That was irrelevant. The judge still had jurisdiction. They nevertheless kept it continuing to go to El Salvador, and then said, oh, too late, there's nothing we can do. Booseberg, of course, was furious and has been trying to unroll this whole mess ever since then. It's gone up and down to the Supreme Court, and which has affirmed detainees have due process rights that clearly were denied them. And at this point, it fell back to Booseberg to figure out what to do. Okay, here is his big but not last opinion. I say not last because it's clear it envisions an ongoing process. It begins, however, and now we're talking gulag, with a long quote from Kafka's The Trial, which is a remarkable statement by a federal court judge. That quote ends, "How can I be under arrest in this manner," says Kay, who is the protagonist of the trial. "We don't answer such questions," says the guard. "Good heavens, there's been a mistake. I shouldn't be here." And the silent guard said, "We don't make mistakes. That is the law." "I don't know that law," Kay responds. "You'll feel it eventually," the guard says. Okay, a total chilling picture of totalitarian rule, which really is not so apocryphal here. I mean, it's really what happened. We know one of the prisoners, Abrego Garcia, he's in a different case, but he's been seen only once. Somebody spoke with him, a senator, Chris Van Hollen, and it really is that. They're in a very, very, very rough place, and nobody has had any communication with them at all, etc. Okay, Booseberg's ruling. These guys have to get due process. You didn't give it to them. They have to get due process. The administration has proffered all kinds of evasive maneuvers, including suggesting these are really very dangerous gang members. They're members of Tren de Aragua and that operate in the U.S., and so they're bad customers. Second, the president lawfully invoked is the argument, and like a half an hour before all this happened, it's supposed to be public, they invoke it and boom, start rounding people up, but lawfully invoked. The Alien Enemies Act and the lawfulness of that turns on whether or not we are at war or not, or predatory incursion by a foreign country, which the administration has argued variously either means Venezuela in some way, or the gang itself is the equivalent. Really, really far-fetched and been rejected by every court to have considered it. But the main point in Booseberg in his long, some 60-page opinion is nevertheless being very cautious, even as he is scathing in his criticism for the administration. And a quick side point, it remains for him to determine whether or not they, in fact, should be held in contempt. That part of the case is on pause while the D.C. Circuit is considering a petition from the administration, but that's not going away. But back here to the merits, what he said is these guys must get due process. Now, recall there's another case right now where there's a plane that didn't make it all the way to its destination and is just on the tarmac, has been for over a week in northern Africa, but the United States has been ordered to give the due process that the deportees are entitled to on the plane if necessary, bring in lawyers, bring in interpreters, and the like. So what Booseberg has said here is you got to give them due process, and it's up to a court to make the finding under the standards for a habeas corpus proceeding, whether or not, in fact, they're members of the gang, as they say they are not, and whether or not Trump validly invoked it. That's going to be for a court to say, and that's the really key element that the Supreme Court affirmed for Booseberg, and he has been trying to implement that opinion. Now, even as he totally takes them to task for their squirreliness and evasion, he is stepping very lightly, and I think is clearly conscious of not getting out front with a remedy that the Supreme Court or a higher court might slap down, even as they recognize the transgression of due process protections. So what he said here is they got to get it. That's for starters. So we have to go through and figure out how that can happen. Now, it's a whole different situation, right, than North Africa. They are in the prison in CCOT and subject to either the real or, I would say, the contrived assertion that, oh, I'm sorry, it's just too late now. Now it's a whole diplomatic issue, and it's between us and El Salvador and their president, and we just can't do anything, and it's a state secret diplomacy, blah, 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 emergency, blah, blah, blah. Booseberg has said as to that, maybe, we'll see. I'm telling you, they still have to get due process, and we need to figure it out. So in the first instance, and that is, look, if there was a showing by the United States to provide due process would be the equivalent of starting World War III, Booseberg would understand you need to back down. But to the extent there's been some consideration given to these kinds of issues, and the assertion of emergency power, he's saying, we got to figure this out, and he's getting very close to not facilitate, but make happen. But what he said here is, I'm leaving it to you in the first instance, United States. You can propose an approach. I will grant this idea. I'm not even sure about it, but on balance, I think you're right that now that they are in El Salvador, it is a sort of different situation that maybe does invoke international or diplomatic interest that the courts shouldn't muck about in. That I think there's room to revisit that, but for now, they got to get it, and United States, I'll try to be flexible, but the next step is for you to tell what approach will work so that these people get their rights, but nevertheless, at least in this first instance, you proffer some way in which your interests are protected as well. So that's sort of the bottom line. It is a riddle or a mystery of sorts that it's to the United States to solve, he's saying in the first instance. Maybe it portends some kind of going into CCOT prison, working it out diplomatically, etc. We'll see how hard the DOJ pushes back. They have been giving considerably more ground of late as they've been getting their brains beaten in cases around the country, and as public sentiment has been battling against them. So just today, they have actually brought someone home, and they've been responsive as opposed to taciturn in other cases. So here it is, the sort of, fountainhead of all this litigation, with a very respected chief judge, even though they trashed him and called him a communist and every name in the book. Booseberg is really respected on both sides of the aisle. He was the law school roommate of Justice Kavanaugh, as I've mentioned. The Supreme Court has already ruled for him. And in terms of the basic mission that these prisoners now have a right to due process, which they haven't received. So I think we'll see him continue to take baby steps, but really in a way that will then ensure that if push comes to shove and he's holding them in contempt, or he's saying we're going to do it this way and they appeal, that the courts above him will have his back. And that's the number one thing. What you don't want to have happen here is a court come out with a big order and a hold that judges decide this, and the administration be able to reverse it, including in the Supreme Court, for reasons that give some doubt to the whole country about whether or not the courts are ultimately in charge of the Constitution. Here, while there's a lot of sort of solicitude for the administration's now international, diplomatic aspect, which of course is completely of their doing, they rush them away to El Salvador specifically to manufacture this situation. Anyway, while there is, some solicitude to that, Booseberg is putting down his foot and saying, we got to make this happen. U.S., you tell me first. We will take it from there. So there are going to be additional proceedings coming forward. It could be a long time. It's already been, pushing 3 months that these 230 some folks, or some of whom say you got the wrong guy, and we have more evidence that that's happened. Some of whom say you got the wrong statute, that are now, in this sort of torture pit, as it's been described. And I've seen their pictures been published. It really looks like a very Spartan tough place. Anyway, they're there, and Booseberg has made it clear, we're going to do something to make sure they get their rights. There may be a hearing with judicial presence where they say, all right, you are in fact a gang member, or even, though I find this unlikely, and this is the more important question, all right, it was properly invoked by the administration, the Alien Enemies Act, or maybe, all right, the international diplomatic situation precludes our remedying this grave injustice. I don't see that last one happening now. I see Booseberg holding the U.S.'s feet to the fire to give them the due process that they should have received up front, never did receive, and under circumstances suggesting very strongly, as I say, Booseberg still retains that issue that hasn't been decided, that the U.S. basically played fast and loose and knowingly violated his order to try to get them to El Salvador so they could then claim, nothing to be done anymore. They're out of our jurisdiction. So much more to come, but this is a really big, important opinion that I think will also influence the AEA litigation around the country. Talk to you later. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.